All right, y'all, it's just about 8:30, so let's go ahead and get started. First, let me apologize for the technical difficulties that we had last time. I thought that we had calibrated the projector on last Wednesday, but then I remembered we didn't because we had one of these discussion sections like we're having today. It looks like a fair bit of you were actually able to get onto YouTube and watch the lecture, though. So let's start with that. Any just questions, comments, concerns about last Friday's video lecture before we start the class? And for those of you who didn't get the chance to see it, it was probably the most mathy lecture that we're going to have this term. But again, this is a leadership class. This is not a math class. It's not a stats class. This is a leadership class. And the important thing that I want to get driven home to you all with last Friday's lecture, but this class more generally, is the philosophy behind data, the philosophy behind causality, the philosophy behind information. And what we learned on Friday is that one of the things that information allows us to do is update our beliefs. And I really think today's discussion is going to help us really solidify that point. Let me also just do a bit of housekeeping. This week, and I apologize again, is our heaviest reading week. That's a hard thing to say. Reading week. We have 3 chapters this week. Today we're doing chapter 8 from The Signal and the Noise. Then we're doing, I believe, chapter 6 from Birds from West, and one of the after chapters on Friday. Now, I know that can seem sort of onerous, sort of like heavy lifting, looking ahead to it, but there's a couple things I want to drive home. One is these are not textbook chapters. These are pop-sci books. So they should go fairly quickly for you all. If you have any difficulty keeping up with the reading, that's fine. Just reach out to me or reach out to Dr. Riles at the ARC and we can get you the assistance you need. But it should go fairly quickly. The other thing is because they're not textbooks, we bounce around a lot. You'll notice that we read chapter 8 today without having read any of the book before that. And I think the chapters should be fairly self-contained, but if anyone has any trouble following some of the plot points or some of the discussion points, just let me know and we can go over it in further detail either in student hours or in discussion. All right, so let's start the way we always do with just questions, comments, and concerns. Does anyone have anything they want to get off their chest before we begin discussion? Cool, so who wants to summarize our reading for today? Chapter 8 and The Signal of the Noise. Juliet, would you like to summarize our reading? Okay, someone volunteer. In the pink, and say your name.
Jaden.
All right?
It started out by talking about my experience growing up and how he made gambles that changed his life and how he did that, like what his feelings about it. And then it started going into different theories by different people and how their mindset was vastly different from how they related. And then it started showing examples, and it went back to,
No, you're doing great, thank you. And thank you for volunteering.
yeah, it went back, I forget what the last part was, but it was something that we talked about. And it was like why the theories, the difference between like chance or perfection and probability, and how humans have errors, but the computer has errors because it can't perceive like the human errors. And then yeah, that's what I got from it.
Right, anyone have anything they want to add to that? So for those of you who didn't hear what Jaden said, what this chapter was about was, first it introduced this guy who's a sports gambler, Bob, can't pronounce his last name, and he has sort of a unique take on sports gambling, which is rather than try and have one big thing that he does. He does a bunch of little things all the time. He's always updating his information. And when you're gambling with large, large sums of money, it's not about being right all the time. It's about being right more than you're wrong, right? It's making big bets, some of which will pay off. And that really relates to what they were talking about in this chapter and also what we were talking about in Friday's lecture, this idea of probability known as Bayes' theorem, that we can use little bits of information to update our beliefs. We can use new information to update our beliefs. Now, this is true for all of us here at Sweet Bar, for all of us in general, but it's also sort of interesting philosophically beyond that, because when it comes to data, when it comes to information, when it comes to the decisions we make with these data and these informations, there's sort of one big question that to some extent is unanswered, to some extent is unknowable. And it's, does probability even exist? And by that I mean, if we knew everything, if we had all the available information and all the unavailable information, if we had every possible bit of information, would the world just be a series of calculations? In other words, is the world deterministic? Or is there still random chance? So there are some areas of the world where having all the information gets us pretty good knowledge of the state of the world. Things like this morning's weather. We have barometers to measure air pressure. We have thermometers to measure temperature. We have radar, LiDAR, Doppler. We have a fair bit of information, and weather becomes fairly predictable, fairly knowable. But when we push that out, I can probably tell you with a good degree of certainty what the weather is tomorrow. I probably can't tell you what the weather is going to be at 7:35 p.m. on October 15th, 2035. And that's because to some things, there is, at least according to Bayes and some other statistical and data philosophers, this concept of random chance. We're going to be talking a lot about random chance. Again, more from the perspective of leadership and philosophy than math. So with Jaden's summary in mind, what did you guys think of this chapter? I know it's Monday, I know it's early, but you gotta, yeah. And introduce yourself. I didn't hear you. Uh-huh.
The scenario that God was shooting out of the world, we talked about just how it can be applied to different scenarios, and I thought it was interesting how different the topics were, but how
All right, so Peyton thought it was interesting. She really appreciated the examples. What did the rest of you think? Yeah, Lily.
I really liked what was the writing style of the author.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's very emphasized on kind of conversation. Like we were talking about the entire time of looking at the context of the statistics. And I thought it was funny when they went back to talk about Asian theory and went back with Nick Fisher and he kind of trashed them. He was just talking about how the lack of context kind of removed Fisher from the real world. And that's how better like John Munger was able to connect things so well.
Right, excellent point. So we'll keep talking about what you guys thought, but just to run off what Lily said for a little bit. Lily said she really liked the writing style. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this chapter was written by Nate Silver, who runs the website 538, and sort of got his start writing on the internet about a whole bunch of things, notably politics, but also sports betting and also burrito rankings. He wanted to see when he was about your age, he was an undergrad at UChicago, who had the best burrito in the neighborhood. I'll also point out, because you noted how there are these sort of two main schools of thought in statistics, one of which, frequentist or Fisherian. Fisher, in the history of stats, is actually a really, really terrible person. Huge racist, big supporter of the eugenicist movement. But the stats that we still learn to this day and talk about a fair bit all stem from him. He was a big supporter of things like experimentation and randomized controlled trials, which are very important in statistics. Some of the things we're going to discuss moving forward. He developed a lot of the hypotheses testing that we won't be talking about, or somewhat beyond the scope of this class. But Lily, you mentioned how you thought the context was important in learning about stats from what the data are telling us. I just also want to point out that the context is important in learning about stats from the history of it as well. What about the rest of you? What do you all think? See, I saw a hand earlier.
I was always surprised by how, like, at the end of the chapter it says that, I like that name, but the sport's better.
Mm-hmm.
He only gets it right 56% of the time, versus, like, the other highest is 53, which seems, and they explain this, but it still seems so low. But because there's so many tiny, what do they call it, like speckles of probability, which I just thought was interesting because that seems like such a low percentage.
Anyone else? Anything they want to add? Just general perceptions of the chapter? Yeah, and introduce yourself. Uh-huh. Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear you. Right, so for those who didn't hear Madison, she appreciated the figures and the numbers, and this is important because when we think about making decisions in a data-driven world, there are different ways to picture these decisions. We can picture them like Lil was talking about, with context and common sense. We can picture them sort of more mathematically, more abstractly. We can picture them with figures, with numbers. Anyone else? Any perceptions of the text that they want to talk about? Yeah, okay.
Just how much time and effort they can spend analyzing statistical stuff. He spends so much time on this. So there's a lot of ways to gambling for certain people versus for others.
Right. So between what Peyton was saying about the examples being really meaningful and what Lily was saying about context being really meaningful and what you two were saying specifically about little changes in gambling making big differences in your, in this case, annual income, I want to talk about something that struck me about this chapter, which is this concept of conventional wisdom. So what do you think? What did we learn about conventional wisdom from this chapter? Keep in mind the answer could be nothing, right? You might not have read the chapter the same way I did. Yes, yeah.
I think the possible example of that could be when like games that, or not games, teams that aren't making it to the playoff will kind of like let each other get a ton of points so that their ratings can go up, and there's like no end goal except to get your ratings up for the next season. And that if you accurately can look at that, then you can place bets on points where the games go really far over. So like maybe that could be good.
Right, absolutely right. And I think that underscores what we were saying a little bit earlier about context. What about the rest of you? What did we learn about conventional wisdom from this chapter? Or perhaps more broadly, what did we learn about different modes of thinking, right? Because relying on conventional wisdom is one mode of thinking, but there are other ways we can think about problems and data-driven decisions moving forward. So what did you all learn about modes of thinking? Yeah, I know it's early on Monday, but you guys got to participate. Yeah, JD.
One of the ones that first stood out to me was how when he placed the bet, he thought about how much it would be if you won, how much it would be if you lost, and then the difference between that is how much he paid, which I thought was kind of ironic because the first bet that he made, the example that it's using, he didn't have any other money, so he couldn't get another bet, so he never would bet that he the net profit.
Right, so for those who didn't hear Jaden, she said one of the things that struck out was when this guy was gambling, he thinks about it sort of in terms of expected value, expectation, which on the one hand is very statistical. For those of you who don't really understand the concept, it's if I make this bet, how much can I expect to win on average? If I make this bet 10 million times, what will the average outcome be? And that can be very powerful as a mode of thinking, but it's also, like Jaden mentioned, somewhat problematic, right? Because I don't have billions of dollars to make this bet billions of times, right? If you only have enough money for one bet, then the expectation might not be that meaningful. And it also highlights sort of another problem with thinking about things probabilistically, which is at the end of the day, though before the event happens, we can assign a probability to it. At the end of the day, either the Lakers win or they lost. At the end of the day, the probability is either 0 or 1. Though beforehand, what we would say in math and statistics, ex ante, before the thing, it might have had a 20, 30, 40% chance of happening. At the end of the day, it either happened or it didn't. So I want to read one of the passages from the book, which I found really compelling, which is, if the future exists in shades of probabilistic gray, the present arrives in black and white. So I found this really striking. Again, not only do we know that at the end of the day, events are realized, but it also highlights sort of another interesting thing about probability and about the way we can think about probability moving forward, which is improbable events happen all the time. Just because they were improbable doesn't mean that they can't happen. Can anyone think of an example of this? An improbable event happening? Yeah, Cami. Okay. So it's unlikely to experience a tornado in Virginia. Might even be more unlikely to experience a tornado, say, in northern Virginia, where the population's more dense, the heat will dissipate the tornado pretty quickly. But just because it's unlikely doesn't mean it can't happen. When I was an undergrad, there was a huge tornado in Atlanta that ripped the panels off the Westin Hotel. It's the big cylindrical hotel that you see in pictures of the skyline. You can see it on that Walking Dead poster that's so famous. This was really improbable that such a strong tornado would touch down in such a big city. But it still happened. Anyone else examples of improbable events that happened? Yeah, Julia. Okay, so the likelihood of a meteor hitting is very, very low. But meteors have in the past struck the Earth. We have the meteors to prove it. Anyone else? So let's bring it a little bit more down to earth, some recent events. Recently, armed insurrectionists stormed the Capitol because they felt the election was stolen. And they felt this in part because they've been lied to by politicians, but in part because there were some unlikely events which led to the election of Joe Biden. Things like him carrying typically Republican counties, or him carrying typically Republican states, or him carrying counties that had previously, or I should say failing to carry counties that had previously predicted the end result of the election, but didn't in this election. And when we talk about these things in probabilistic terms, and particularly in compound probabilistic terms, so carrying 14 of 18 counties or something like that, that sounds like an unlikely event. And if you had thought about the probability from, say, the standpoint of 1 year ago today, it would have seemed quite unlikely. 1 year ago today, Joe Biden hadn't yet been declared the Democratic nominee. So 1 year ago today, the probability of Joe Biden having carried 14 of 18 bellwether counties, Elizabeth, we'll get to you in one sec, would have seemed quite unlikely. But that doesn't mean that the fact that this improbable event happened, and particularly this improbable event happened from the eye of 1 year ago today, didn't happen. Improbable events happen all the time. One of the things that struck me about how we bring in information, how we think about conventional wisdom and other modes of thinking, is this difference between ex ante and ex post, before the thing and after the thing. So let's talk about a super duper unlikely event. Anyone play cards? Lily plays cards. When you shuffle a deck of cards, the odds that that deck got shuffled in that exact order are practically zero. But the other thing to note is that when you shuffle a deck of cards, they have to land in some order. And at the end of the day, that's the order it landed. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? 52 cards in a deck. To pick the exact order of 52 cards is astronomically low. So if beforehand I think, what are the odds that I get a deck of cards that I've just shuffled, it's perfectly random, with the 3 of diamonds, and then the 4 of hearts, and then the jack of clubs, and then however many, up to that 52 deck, the odds are practically zero. But ex post, after the thing, I shuffled the deck of cards and it landed in order. Elizabeth, you had a hand up earlier.
Yeah, I was kind of off topic now, but I was going to say it's also improbable based on like the past that an incumbent who's in the presidential election has not happened that frequently.
Right, and if you know, political examples aren't as compelling to you, or you don't want to talk about it right now for any number of reasons, we can put it in sports terms again. It was improbable at the beginning of that season where Bob Volandes made this bet that the Lakers were going to win the finals that season. And improbable doesn't mean impossible. So he thought maybe there was a 36% chance, right? The conventional wisdom thought maybe there was a 25% chance. But at the end of the day, either they win or they don't. Improbable does not mean impossible. Question so far? So how do we bring in other modes of information? If conventional wisdom could be wrong, if probabilities might be wrong, if what we're learning is that the way to think about these decisions is to update our probabilities with new information, that seems sort of easier said than done. So what do you guys think? What are some ways we can bring in new information? Yeah. So what we learned from Friday's lecture and today's reading is that the way we update our thoughts is by bringing in new information. What Bayes' theorem is all about is updating our previous beliefs with new information. So let's go back to Elizabeth's point. It's improbable for an incumbent to lose an election. But there's new information. There's a poorly handled pandemic. There is a recession that results from that poorly handled pandemic. There is a historically disliked president. There is a historically well-admired candidate. We can use all this new information to update our prior probability of incumbents typically lose elections. So what are some ways, what are some strategies you guys have in your own lives for bringing in new information? Sita, does that answer your question? Yeah, Annika.
Do you mean like it could be like surveys or research?
Okay, so Annika says surveys and research. That's one way. Excellent point. But it might not always be possible to, say, conduct independent research or survey your peers or whoever you want to survey. Cami.
I think comparing drafting of the arguments and whatever I'm looking at may give me a more clear direction on if I need to data.
Right, so Cami said what she might do to update her prior belief with new information is some sort of compare and contrast tool. Yeah, Lily.
The book talks about individual prior probability. So like when you agree to something, looking at the prior expectations and then comparing it and kind of reworking your thoughts on this on how probability doesn't happen.
Yeah, so Lily switches over to what the book talks about. Excellent point. So what are some strategies that Bob the Gambler uses when he's updating his prior probability with new information? Yeah, Jaden. Excellent point. Yeah, and remind me of your name, I'm sorry. Peyton?
You would social media, you look at Twitter, figure out what you want to get,
Right, so let's take Jaden and Peyton together a little bit, right? So we've got Bob the Gambler, he's a sports bettor, he bets on basketball. We've got some prior information based on how teams have done so far, their records, our personal beliefs. Perhaps they might be biased, right? I think the Washington Wizards are going to do great because they now have Russell Westbrook, they're the best team. Maybe their record doesn't reflect that. But one thing I can do is update those beliefs with new information, the games that are being played tonight, watching them, the Twitter feeds of prominent athletes and commentators and coaches. What are some other ways, either you guys in your own lives or Bob the Gambler in the book, can bring in new information? Yeah, Lily. Right, so Lily makes an important point. Not necessarily, new information doesn't necessarily move our posterior beliefs. So remember, when we're talking about Bayes' rule, we're talking about our prior belief that we had and the updated belief that we have based on our new information. And Lily, your point, I think, relates a lot to what Cami was saying earlier, right, about comparing and contrasting. New information doesn't have to move our posterior belief. And there's sort of two modes that can happen. One is if our previous belief was very strong. If I think the Washington Wizards are the best team, if I think Sweetbrier's equestrian program is the best program, and I believe this with my entire heart and soul, how we do at the meet against UGA might not move my posterior belief that much. The other way new information might not move our belief is the quality of the new information, right? Cami said she compares and contrasts. So, you guys have a meet coming up against UGA. What if something weird happens at the meet? What if Lily is sick and the judges are blind and you guys, your hotel room sucks and no one gets a good night's rest and maybe one of the horses needs a new shoe? Maybe, in that case, the meet against UGA isn't going to be the high quality information to update my prior belief that Sweetbrier's equestrian program is the best one. Updating our beliefs is important. Updating our beliefs is important when it comes to making decisions in a data-driven world, in part because if we don't update our beliefs, then they're not data-driven decisions. They're dogma. They're religion. And certainly religion is fine, but it's outside the scope of this class. But it's also important when we think about updating our beliefs to assess the quality of the information we're using to update them. Questions on that? So Peyton mentions how Bob the Gambler uses social media feeds. And that's a good way for getting new information, but it's also a good way for getting suspect information. Let's think about this a little bit more broadly. How do we learn more? How do we learn stuff? How do you all learn? Yeah, Annika. Okay. Lectures, reading. Anyone else? Anyone have any unique strategies for learning more? Yeah, Julia.
Sometimes it's not reading
All right. Yeah, see you.
Just talking with people, and then either if you, I mean, maybe you pick up something new and then you go research it, but just talking.
Excellent. Ray, was that a hand or a stretch? All right. So talking to people in the back, was that a hand? And introduce yourself.
my name is Shemina.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that you can start experiencing it for yourself or getting other perspectives.
Okay. So we have reading, we have talking, we have listening. Well, we'll put lecturing sort of broadly in listening. We have experiential learning. How do these different modes update your guys' beliefs? Do you find one more helpful or less helpful than the other? Yeah, Ray.
I think for like athletes, when we go back and we watch film,
Mm-hmm.
about ourselves, it like we can control it. We can stop and play when we aren't in the moment, like when we in the game. So I feel like having visuals that you can hands-on research.
Yeah, and Riley, I think I saw a hand earlier.
Yeah, I was gonna say experience is something I feel like is the best way to change your mind and perspective on things. Because you can sit and listen and you can read stuff but actually experiencing it. I feel like it's the most hands-on way to think about it.
Excellent point. So how do we weigh the fact that experiences might also be biased, right? We're going to talk later about sample size, and experience is a relatively small sample size. And I'm not asking that rhetorically, and we're going to talk about it in a second, but what strikes me is that experiences are particularly good for things like changing your mind if and only if they're successful. So if I tell you I hate Brussels sprouts, and then I eat really good Brussels sprouts, that might change my mind. But that seems like it has to, thread a lot of needles to get there. Lily.
I'm just going off of experience, and I do like certain things, but I think sometimes the experience is an outsider that kind of represents the person's bias, and it is detrimental. Because I have a friend who doesn't really believe in COVID, and she got COVID, and I was like, oh, maybe she'll think differently about it. But she didn't get any symptoms, so it just made her think more, oh, this isn't real. And then it made it worse.
Right, so when we think about updating our beliefs based on new information, the strength of that prior belief is so important. Right, so Peyton, let's go back to something that struck you at the beginning of class, which is you really like the examples. And one of the examples in our reading was this person who finds a strange pair of underwear in their partner's dresser drawer. Right? And at first glance, at first blush, this might seem really problematic. Why would there be a strange pair of underwear? And one conclusion is your person is cheating on you. But we need to take into account the strength of our prior belief. If this is someone I trust wholeheartedly, might have been a mix-up at the laundromat, might have been a mix-up with, luggage in the days when we used to travel. It might be, a friend stayed over because they had too much to drive home. Might be any number of reasons that ex ante before the thing seemed like a really low probability event, but ex post, after the thing, once you found the strange pair of underwear, might seem more and more likely, particularly given our prior information on how trustworthy our person is. So, Lily, can we run with something you brought up earlier? So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was how context matters. And remember, this is, and this is something I will say all 12 weeks of our semester, so apologize in advance for repeating myself. This is not a stats class, this is not a math class, this is a leadership class. So one of the things that it's up to us as leaders to ask ourselves is it right to use this sort of context? Is it moral? And that's actually a little more profound than it sounds at first blush, because context can also be problematic. And if I didn't say context, if I said subjectivity, would that change your answer at all? So what do you guys think? Is it moral to use our subjective beliefs when assessing information? Yes, you know.
One thing that I had thought of when we were talking about how we learn new information, and I said talking to people, that if I'm having a conversation with friends that I trust and that have maybe beliefs similar to mine, I am probably going to take what they say as truth. But maybe there was a mix-up of information and it is not the case. So like there, I trust them, so I'm going to believe what they say more readily than maybe a stranger.
Right. So for anyone who didn't hear what Sita had to say, when you're talking with people, you're updating your information, you're getting new information, it might update your beliefs. But Sita's found that when she talks to people she trusts, like her close friends, maybe she's sort of less interrogative of that information. Yeah, Lily.
What I would say is that I think it's impossible not to have those subjectivity. And, before I came to college, I was in a really small conservative town, and my viewpoints were completely different than they are now. And I do think having person-to-person interaction is a lot more of a better communication than just seeing something online, because that's so easy to be like, no, that's not true.
Right, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but to Lily's point, maybe it's even impossible to get rid of this subjectivity. So, excellent point, but again, bring it back to the morality of it. Should we try and limit our subjectivity, or should we lean into it? What do you guys think? Emily D., what do you think? What about the rest of you? We all have subjective beliefs that we bring to the table. New information can update these beliefs, but it still might be problematic. It might be. It's up to you guys to decide. This is a leadership class. If those subjective beliefs, are influencing our mode of thought. So what do you guys think? You in the very middle, in the white jacket, with the blue mask. Yeah, and introduce yourself.
I'm Christina. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is this kind of thinking moral? Is it right?
I don't think it's necessarily moral, but I think it's natural. I think it's something that's really hard to change, which I think that this class definitely helps with, but I don't think it's moral.
Okay. Do you think it's amoral? Or immoral? Which are two different things.
I do think that it's immoral, but I think that comes with the natural state of it. I don't think that's anything that I'm consciously control.
Yeah, blue sweatshirt.
I'm Kaya.
Okay.
I think it's only immoral if you're aware of your biases and choose to ignore them. So if you're aware that you might have a specific meaning towards one belief, and you choose to ignore the fact that there is false information, then it's moral. But if you take information you don't know is false and you spread it to people, it's bad. So you did it now. So I think the best that everyone can do is understand that it's our job to build this information and figure out what's true, what's false, before we tell it to other people.
Elizabeth.
Not to get too philosophical or anything, but I kind of think that it's a subjective opinion to think that we can really be objective about anything, especially when it comes to personal opinion. Because I think we tend to be a little bit to see science and mathematics as being completely objective, but is a little bit flawed.
Right. So for those of you who didn't hear Elizabeth, what she said is she thinks objectivity is sort of a myth. And you raised science and math, which is, I'm really glad you did, because my next question is this subjectivity that we all have, is it problematic, especially in the realm of science? Is subjectivity problematic? Darryl, we haven't heard from you yet today. Subjectivity problematic?
Do you want to phrase that?
Sure. So we all have prior beliefs. When we're evaluating information, particularly in the realm of science and technology and new things, we're bringing those subjective beliefs to the table. Is that problematic?
I mean, like, having those beliefs are not always problematic. It's what you do about it. Like, some people think that, like, just because you're conservative, I'm not conservative, but, like, they'll attack someone just for being bad, and, like, that's wrong to just kind of have that belief where you just think, oh, this person's always wrong because they're this, but maybe you gotta kind of see different sides of that person.
Green sweatshirt. And introduce yourself.
I'm Cynthia.
Uh-huh.
So, for me, I think it's problematic in certain situations with certain people and certain biases. Everyone has their own biases, everyone has their own stereotypes, and we're human, we make mistakes, and we can't always control certain things. Some people are going to have biases against certain people because of traumatic experience. They're always going to have that, which might cause problematic situations later on. In a certain situation, the specific concept.
Excellent point, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so I think we can all agree that, like, there are definitely some biases that are innocent and some that are harmful biases. But I think if you have to, like, qualify that something is harmful in one situation and not the other, it's not the actual, like, the concept of having a bias isn't the problem. It's when like, so it's like when someone disagrees with you, basically. It's like, oh, like, I don't care if you have a bias towards agreeing with me, but if you have a bias to use against me, then that's when I have a problem. So the problem isn't the bias to use, I don't know how to say that word anymore. It doesn't sound like a word anymore. But then your problem is really that someone disagrees with you.
Right. Anyone else? So here we are trying to make decisions in a data-driven world. That's difficult. We have our prior beliefs that we're bringing to the table. We have new information that we're being presented with. We have to evaluate that new information. It might move our prior beliefs, it might not. So my last big question for the day for all of you, and then we can go home, is what lesson do we take away from all this? What lesson do we take away from chapter 8 in the signal and the noise? Yeah, Chloe?
Yes.
All right.
That beliefs and opinions are important, but it's also important to
All right, so for anyone who didn't hear that, beliefs and opinions are important, but it's also important to take in new information. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Anyone else? What big lesson did you take away from chapter 8? Yeah, Sita.
This is more so for our discussion, but I can, like, if I attempt to look at something objectively, it's probably still very subjective. So when looking at probability or things that I'm trying to make a decision about, I should definitely be aware of that.
All right. What about you? We haven't heard from you yet today. White sweatshirt. You just pointed to yourself.
Oh, me?
And introduce yourself.
I'm Cameron. I kind of agree with Chloe about how, like, you should always kind of pay attention and listen to, like, your own opinions, so you should always be open to others and, like, new information, because you never know if you, like, change your mind or, like, explain everything.
All right. So be aware of your own opinion, but also listen to others. Something has the potential to change your mind, though it doesn't have to at some point. What else? What big lesson did you take away from chapter 8? Yeah, Ray.
Not all information, what Lily was talking about, like, not all information is
Right, excellent point. And when we're taking in new information, one of the things that we might have to do is ignore information strategically. Anyone else? What big lesson did you take away from chapter 8? What about you with the hat? Yeah.
That when it comes to a lot of, basically what we've been talking about this whole time is like believing in what some people say and what some people don't. When it comes to it, you have to figure it out for yourself.
And introduce yourself.
Brianna, but people call me Bree.
All right. Anyone else? You with the gray hat in front. And introduce yourself. Yeah.
I have to agree with some of the I have to agree with some of the people about how I don't even know.
It's fine. But introduce yourself. I'm still trying to learn everyone's name.
I'm Helena, but I go by that.
All right. Anyone else? Big lessons? Yeah, Cammy.
God is important, but it's only important if you have the context and facts to.
All right, so data is important, but data is only important to the extent that we have context to understand those data. So I think that's a great point to wrap it up on. Wednesday, we will be talking about data in the sense of data visualization. We have a chapter. We'll also have a very short lecture at the beginning. Remember when you guys exit to use the side doors. Keep making student hours appointments if you need anything. Those of you who have athletic contracts that you need me to sign, either email them or come up here. And we'll see everyone Wednesday morning. Thanks, guys.